And here's the model at the start of the build. For the base starter build, I'll be utilizing this vintage Tamiya. Well, what do you mean, what am I doing? Yeah, I'm building this old model kit. Why? What, this thing? Yeah, this thing's ancient. It dates back to like the 1970s. Yeah, they're still in production. This one? Yeah, I bought it the other day. Why? Oh, you mean you want me to rebuild an old model kit? Yeah, sure, why not? Or shortage of those. Let me go ahead and find one of my failures. No. Ah! I think this might do the trick. Yep, that is one sad excuse for a build. Perfect. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com and I welcome you today for another episode of Old Tank Repair. On this episode, we're dealing with this old vintage Academy M981 FISTV fire support team vehicle. Just like with many of the other smaller scale builds that are found on this channel, this model here is built for my own personal collection and is not for sale and or purchase. However, like I often mention in these build videos, I frequently take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35 scale and 1/6 scale. For availability and pricing information, that information would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. Just like with the other videos in the OTR lineup, this one here was another one of those models that I built when I was younger and over the years fell into a really bad state of disrepair. In this video, I take the model from the original configuration that we saw in the intro and bring it up to the configuration that we have here. I'll be discussing not only the original state of the build, but walking you through all of the techniques and tricks that went into the model, bringing it up to the condition that we see here. Because of this is going to be a longer format video, so I recommend either watching this video in segments or possibly hitting that little gear icon on the corner in order to speed it up. Having said all that, let's go ahead and start by going back to when the model was first started so we get a good idea on what the base build looked like. And here we have in its poor decrepit state a model at the beginning of its rebuild. This vehicle originally started off as a 1/35 scale Academy M981 Fire Team Support Vehicle, or FISTV. I'm pretty sure the guy that thought of that acronym probably thought it sounded cool, but regardless of that, the model itself is another one of my botched youth builds, and it's about time that I finally get to it and give it the proper build that it deserves. This model here I picked up from my tried and true local hobby shop back in 1998 at the youthful age of 14. I brought the model home and immediately started it since it was something I picked up over the holiday break, and it was something that I worked on non-stop until I completed it to the lovely illustrious condition that we see it here. Like I stated before, at the time I was 14 years old. Christmas break just started, which, by the way, at the time, of course, when you're that age, is just an achievement that feels oh so good when you finally make it. And I needed something to do during that time off, because I figured I wasn't going to be able to play 007 GoldenEye for the entire duration of that vacation. Although that is exactly what I did, but I still needed something to do during the downtime in between. So I went ahead and ran to the hobby shop with 25 bucks in hand to find a model kit. When I made it to the hobby shop, the first thing I did was steer clear and walk straight past the Dragon tank aisle, because if anyone's a fan of the channel, you'll know exactly why. To which then it led me to the Tamiya aisle. Now the Tamiya aisle was great. The problem was I either already bought or had those kits already in my collection, or they were kits that were above my price range. So I needed to look for something else. Right next to the Tamiya aisle, there was the Academy aisle. And I figured at the time, hey, Academy kits are cool, they're affordable, and they're basically just upgraded versions and improved versions of Tamiya kits. Yes, at that time, I even knew that, because I've already built a few Academy kits in my collection. So I was digging through the Academy stash and I encountered this particular kit here, and I thought, hey, this is awesome. It's an M113, but it's a real cool variant of the M113. I haven't built one of these before, and I already had a few M113s in my collection. One of which was a subject matter of another one of these rebuild videos, but that story's for that video. Anyway, so I saw this kit. Again, I thought it was cool. It's a really interesting variant of the M113 with the tow missile launcher, and I said, you know what, this is perfect. The kit itself was just below 25 bucks, so I was able to buy the kit and have a few quarters to throw into my piggy bank. So I got the kit into the car. When my dad was driving me home, I opened up the cellophane wrap to see the kit's contents. To which then I was immediately disappointed, because the kit completely honeypotted me, because as soon as I looked through some of the runners, I encountered the tracks. And as you can quite clearly see on this model, was something that I was going to have a problem with, and I knew that at the time as well. No joke, the second I saw that track runner, my reaction was pretty much,
No, God! No, God, please, no! 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 No!
I mean, it was like, really? You too, Academy? Are you serious? And, you know, like I stated before, this kit here is a product of the mid-1990s. And at this time, not just Tamiya, but Academy, Italeri, all the companies were utilizing these shitty tracks for their vehicles. And it, like I stated in many other videos, it really sucked. The 90s was a real terrible decade for armor modeling in many respects. Since I already had the kit in hand, I might as well try to make the best of it and build it to the best of my abilities. I figured, well, let's see now, I've already screwed up about 4 of these kits now with individual link and length. Maybe by the 5th time around, I should be able to figure it out. And quite clearly, that just wasn't the case. The model itself, I built up in practically no time. These M113 kits, be it from Academy or Tamiya, just go together extremely well. They're very simple kits to build. And like I said, the kit itself went together fairly well, even with my limited techniques of the era. I was still able to get the basic kit done. There are some mistakes on it here and there, but that's something I'm going to touch upon later. Then I went to paint the model. Now, like I stated at the time, I was still really novice when it came time for using an airbrush. So I went ahead and tried to paint this one with a 3-tone NATO camouflage pattern, and this was the end result. The paint job, needless to say, is quite terrible. And I am being pretty hard on myself in a somewhat comedic way, but it was, you know, this was the best I was able to do of the era. Keep in mind, at this time, back in the mid-90s, Tamiya did not have its nice range of 3-tone NATO camouflage paint, which, by the way, if you're painting a NATO vehicle, it's just there's really nothing else to look at. Just get those 3 colors and you'll be able to airbrush anything in NATO that you want. During this era, that wasn't really the case, so I believe the paint was a mix between Model Master and Tamiya. I don't remember which colors are which. This vehicle here kind of blotted out of my memory for obvious reasons. Anyway, so I was able to apply the camouflage pattern in this really bad manner. And then it came time for the tracks, which, needless to say, I totally botched that up. And then this was one of those builds where as soon as the last brushstroke goes on, you just lean back and say, oh crap, this thing sucks. And it went into my cabinet, never to see the light of day again. Until now, when I finally busted out in order to give it a proper once-over. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and take a closer look at this model to see all the mistakes that were made to it when I built it all those years ago. Of course, all these mistakes are going to need to be addressed in order for me to complete the rebuild and restoration. Starting with the running gear and the track, obviously the individual link and link track are not going to be salvaged and are going to be joyfully removed and thrown into the trash can where all individual track links deserve to be. In its place, I'm going to swap them out for a single piece of vinyl track, namely from, of course, your boy AFV Club. The AFV Club tracks were released a number of years after this kit here in the early 2000s, and these tracks here are absolutely awesome. If you have any of these Academy M113s with the Indy links or the Italeri M113, which also has Indy links, these tracks here are going to be invaluable for your build. They are exquisitely detailed with their surface detailing. The track pad's present, the grousers are present, everything is crisply molded, and unlike the old school Tamiya kits, this one here does have the interior detailing. All the interior hinge detailing is there, the center fastener is there for the rubber pad, everything is exactly where it needs to be. While on the tracks, one other thing I want to mention is that aside from the mid-90s versions that we have here to have the individual link and length, the other M113 kits that Academy released both before and after that time frame utilize a single piece vinyl track design. And those tracks are actually really good quality. They have quality on them both on the exterior and interior portion of the tracks that honestly are basically on par with the ones from AFV Club. So much so that if you have one of those kits, the AFV Club tracks are just not necessary. Moving further back takes us to the rear extended fuel tanks. These are the kit originals and were assembled out of box. They went on pretty well. I may need to clean them up a little bit depending on how the paint strips off. Note the fuel tanks. This one here, I kind of used a little bit too much Tesser's red tube bomb glue and it caused the plastic to cave in on itself. At the time I thought it was kind of cool. Looks like the jerry can is dinged. but this is probably something I'm going to revise and swap it out for a fresh, clean jerry can. This one over here, it's in better shape, but I'm not sure if I'm going to keep it or not. That remains to be seen. The rear door is broken, which is quite typical on these older builds. These M113 ramps are always a very frail bit of equipment. That's true for all of them, from the Italeri to the Tamiya to the Academy. If you're building a 113 and you intend to have the door function, be very careful with the hinge mechanism. These things are oh so frail. So just like with the Australian 113 rebuild, this hatch is probably going to be permanently glued in the closed format. Keep in mind, this kit does not have any interior detailing whatsoever, so having the hatch open and close is really not necessary on this build. Looking over the remainder of the detailing, seems to be pretty much in good shape. Little lift rings are in good condition. They're not broken or missing like they were on the Australian M113. The brush guards and the lights all seem to be in decent shape, as are the smoke grenade launchers. This one over here appears to be missing one of the little rocket nose cone shaped smoke grenades, but I believe I have a few of these in my spare parts bin. If not, or if I can't find them, I could easily just make a mold and cast a fresh one. Looking at the remainder of the top detailing takes me to the little grab handles. They appear to be in decent shape. They're not broken or missing or damaged like they were on the Australian 113 rebuild. Same is also true for the headlights and the brush guards. They appear to be in decent shape. And again, you can see some of the other little fine alterations that Academy made to the original tooling in order to polish it up any further. Like for instance, the driver satch over here. Notice it has that little strip on the back. I believe this is not present on the original A1, but is an A2 configuration. But again, it's a nice little addition that Academy did make to the kit. Also, one other tweak they made was with the periscopes. On the Tamiya kit, the periscope and the brush guard are integrally molded to the top deck, while on the Academy kit here, they're actually two separate components, which is something that lends itself for better accuracy. You know, you see a lot of little small tweaks like that made to these kits, and it's something that really does improve them from the older format. Moving to the exhaust manifold, you can see that the whole engine hatch area here is slightly different with the different formatted grills and with the exhaust manifold itself. Of course, the Tamiya one has that little gooseneck that comes out and pokes out of the side, while the Academy one here did the A2 configuration with the little brush guard, which we can clearly see is clearly damaged and something that's going to have to be fixed. Just like what was seen on the other Australian M113 build I did as a kid, the panels where they all interconnect with each other, I went ahead and added some weld beads. Now the weld beads are a bit on the over-exaggerated end, so I'm going to have to smooth them out just like I did on the other build with some sandpaper and some needle files. On that build, it worked out really, really well, and so I'm not expecting any surprises on this one here since it's literally the same technique and I'm using the same technique to blend them over. Leading us now to the Pioneer tools. The tools themselves, I'm going to have to pop them off in order to get them repainted and re-weathered, but since the pieces are glued on with red tube glue and they're glued onto paint, and the model being 20 plus years old, it doesn't really lend itself for a whole lot of resistance on this part here, but that remains to be seen. On a similar note, there is a tow cable that is found on this portion over here. I have it. It just popped right off of my hand before filming, so that is something that's going to be easily repainted now. From the cable, it takes us to the, hey, check it out, the taillights. And, well, would you know it, I actually painted them correctly. The top portion is painted in red, the bottom portion is painted in silver, so even back then I knew to paint them like that. Now, granted, one of these would be a blackout lens, but that was something I did not know at the time. You know, cut me some slack, guys. I was 14 years old, and I did not exactly have the internet. Oh no, we did. We had AOL dial-up, and I wasn't really able to use the phone because it was a long-distance phone call. So that was the era that I grew up in when I built this model. From there, it takes us to the antenna bases, and this was definitely one area of the build that was thoroughly and horribly botched. This was the way I actually used to build my models with the antennas in this format, where the kit does have the proper spring antenna bases molded in, but I figured, well, spring that are molded in look like junk, so I'm going to snip them off and replace them with real springs, because, you know, that's going to look cooler. And that's exactly what I did. I snipped it off, I drilled out the base with a Dremel, and I added a piece of demo wire here. And then for the spring, I just took another one, made a spring, dropped it in place, and ta-da, there goes my spring antenna base. Yeah, this is something that's not going to be kept and is definitely going to be 1086. The antenna base itself is not going to be salvageable, so in its place, I have, like I stated before in many of these videos, I actually have a rubber mold on hand that I used to cast these type of post-World War II American antenna bases. So those are going to be added on this model to repair the look. This third antenna over here is just going to be amputated completely. I'm probably going to have to clean that up. We'll see how that goes. And that's basically it for the hull. This now takes us to the little mini pseudo turret that we have here. The piece is fully functional. It has a lot of nice articulation to it, and the commander's hatch is fully functional as well. You can open it up. So that's a nice little feature. The piece put together actually pretty well. I'm not seeing any glaring issues with like seams or glue marks or anything like that. It actually did a fairly decent job with the overall assembly. This piece here does, I do remember as a kid, these two pieces here gave me a little bit of problems, these little wings. I would glue them on and then they would just go and just bend in like that. And finally I just said screw it and I just left it in that format. But this is something I'm probably going to have to fix. The vehicle originally, I believe, came with an M60D machine gun, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure if I still have that on hand or if it got thrown away or used or somewhere broken in spare parts. But I believe I do have another M60 Delta on hand. So hopefully I'll be able to dig it up and use it on this build here. But that, again, that remains to be seen. And that's basically it. Well, with story time and highlighting my mistakes out of the way, that now leads us to one thing and one thing only, and that's going to be the paint strip. Now, this model here was kept inside of my display case for about 20 years, so you do not see the thick, chunky layer of dust built up on the surface like you did on the other rebuilds that I've done, namely the M4A3E8 Sherman in episode 1, or the Panzer III rebuild that I did in episode 3 or so. So this one's not going to need that. So I'm not going to have to pre-wash any of the dust off. So this one here is just going to go straight into the denatured alcohol bath to do the paint stripping, which we will cut across to right now. With the model back in the shop, I could go ahead and start the paint stripping procedure and really get this build kicked off. Now, like I stated before, the model is painted with a mix between Tamiya and Model Master paint, and the Model Master paints, if I'm not mistaken, keep in mind guys, it's been a really long time, is not the enamel version, but I believe are the acrylic renditions of the same paint. Outside of that, the entire model is thoroughly covered in a coat of dull coat. And for those who don't know, dull coat is Model Master's or Tester's version of a type of varnish. It's really used to give a matte finish to the model, and it's a way to cut down on the silvering of the decals. And for a while, that material was actually pretty good. In fact, I used it up until very recently. Not so much with painting the entire model like I did with this one here, but with a paintbrush, I would just go ahead and go over the areas of the decal just so that it gives it a nice matte look. And it does work to a certain extent. However, in recent months, I actually moved away from using dull coat entirely on my builds in favor of using a new type of varnish from VMS. I'll touch upon that later towards the end of the video, but one of the reasons why I went ahead and made this change was because the parent company of Model Master announced that they're discontinuing the entire Model Master line. So you're not going to be able to track down any more dull coat or the entire wide range of the Model Master colors. So if you are the type of person that likes using Model Master paints, the writing's basically on the wall. Go ahead, take your paints and have them mix at the Home Depot just so you have that tint or shades that you like to use on your builds on hand. But aside from that, back to this fellow over here. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because the denatured alcohol works fantastically well on loosening up acrylics, but not so much enamels. With the base coat being Tamiya, I believe that the entire surface should be able to be stripped away. The white that's seen on some of the interior sections, namely on the interior portion of the hatches, like you see here, this was done with spray paint. This will not be dislodged from the denatured alcohol bath, but luckily it's on the inside and it's not really going to be a problem. One other thing I want to mention about these kits are the way the decals are done. We have this little tile here with the numbers on it, but this is actually comprised of 3 separate pieces. You would have one decal, which would be the color plate, and then you would have individual separate numbers that you have to put in place. This was something that stuck out to me at the time because it was the first time I actually had to deal with leading and kerning on markings, and you know what? By and large, I think I did a pretty good job on it back in the day. Fortunately, these are not going to be salvaged for this build and are just going to be sacrificed to the denatured alcohol gods. Before I could go ahead and get the model into its paint stripping bath, first thing I'm going to do is take some of the loose parts and put them in a parts bag, so I won't be able to lose them, or hopefully not be able to lose them, throughout the duration of the rebuild. The one part at the moment that popped off was the tow cable, like I mentioned before. There's no point with subjugating this to the denatured alcohol bath since it's painted with spray paints. Nothing is going to be dislodged from the bath. So in the baggie it goes, and hopefully I don't lose it. But if I do, like I said in the other video, I have a mold on hand just for that part there. The only other part that came off during the handling or the pre-prep work for this build are the cruddy tracks, but needless to say, those are not going to be kept. So from this point here, it's now ready to be weighed down. Like I stated in a few of my other model rebuild videos, plastic models really like to float. And in order for the denatured alcohol bath to really have a good effect on the surface, it needs to be thoroughly submerged. So the best way to do this is with weighing it down. So luckily I have some heavy brass or metal objects on hand that are just going to be used just for mass. Just using some spent shell casings and some other loose bits of metal that I had floating around. That should be more than enough for the job at hand. Now, with this one here, the turret doesn't lock on when any sort of locks. It's just pressure fitted in place. Just being careful because I don't want to break any of the accessories up here on top of the model surface because these are actually going to be recycled. And, about to say, and okay, now that the piece is clipped in place, that should do the job. And from this point now, I could go ahead and turn this M113 into a submarine. Well, time for it to take the plunge. But before I do, let me go ahead and go over the court-ordered safety disclaimer. Denatured alcohol is a pretty serious substance, so you want to take the proper safety precautions. Notice I am wearing gloves. Well, I wear gloves all the time in these videos, but specifically true for dealing with any type of paint stripping, denatured alcohol included. You don't want to get this stuff on your skin. You don't want to get it in your eyes. You certainly don't want to drink it. And the fumes can be toxic, so you want to be in a very well ventilated environment and or wear a respirator, and a proper respirator at that. Okay, with all the Safety Sally stuff now out of the way, time to dunk it. Some air bubbles still in the system. Oh, that's just dandy, but that's okay. With the model now submerged, it's time for me to cap it and set the bucket aside to a low traffic area in the shop. This is the type of thing that has a real bad habit on getting kicked, so by putting it in a low traffic area, it should really mitigate that as much as possible. The model is also going to be left in the solution for a longer duration of time compared to the other rebuilds because of the dull coat nature on the surface of this build. The dull coat can act as a barrier, which will prevent the denatured alcohol from penetrating in and allowing it for the paint to start dissolving. But by leaving it in for a longer period of time, this will really alleviate that issue. Okay, so it's been exactly 10 hours since the model was submerged in the solution, so I think that should be plenty time for the denatured alcohol to run its course. So let's go ahead and pop the lid here and see what we have. I'm not really seeing the paint chipping up on the surface visually, but I'm pretty sure that once the paintbrush starts rubbing up and down the surface, the paint will loosen up pretty quickly, or at least that's what the hope is. Alright, so let's go ahead and start with the strip. And yep, it just came right off. So that's really, really, really good news. Well, let's go ahead and start scrubbing away. And it looks like just with the Sherman rebuild, even though the surfaces were thoroughly coated in dull coat, it stood no chance from the denatured alcohol. We got some green putty popping out. Ah, man, it's been a long time since I've used that stuff. FYI, the red putty I use is basically the exact same stuff, only you get more of it and it costs a lot less than a tub, or I should say a smaller tube of Squadron green putty. But it's still interesting to see green putty pop up on one of my builds from time to time. Like with many kits, the Academy kits of the era were molded in this brownish tan type plastic, very similar to the Tamiya kits of the period as well, actually. And the rear hatch finally gave way. So, okay, let's take this rubber band off. It's not necessary, he's not needed anymore. Might as well start with the turret. For this one here, I'm not really putting a whole lot of pressure with the paintbrush. And the paintbrush itself is a semi-stiff bristle brush. Just going up and down with a few passes is really all that it takes to get the paint dislodged. See, and it just, after a few swipes, it just brings it right back down to bare plastic. Now, one other area I wanted to point out was with the periscopes over here. I used a really thick, glossy type enamel paint, and again, it's penetrating right through. What I'm thinking is that the reason why it just cut right through this paint has to do with the base coat underneath was the Tamiya acrylic, and so even though it had the enamel on the surface, just like with the camouflage pattern, it just cut right through it. The only time from what I noticed where the denatured alcohol just doesn't dislodge anything are like these pieces over here, where you can see there's some traces of spray paint on them. The denatured alcohol is just not powerful enough to get rid of that. But for basic acrylic paints, it just destroys it. Looks like the part's starting to give way. See if I could cleanly break it off without causing any damage. Oh, there we go. Perfect. Excellent. I can set this fellow aside. Digging over here. One area I'm trying to get into is this back periscope. Because of all the machinery in the way, it's pretty difficult to get in here with the paintbrush to do the stripping process. Might have to switch to a thinner brush in order to do the job. Sadly, the hatch hinge seems to have suffered some damage. Like I frequently say in these videos, the paint stripping process is a damaging one, and it is not uncommon to suffer some damage on the build during this process. Luckily, all you have to do is take your time, and hopefully you'll be able to track all the missing parts down and repair them during the second phase of the rebuild. But again, unfortunately, that this little guy here just wasn't able to take up with the abuse. But again, I have him on hand, so I can just set him aside and deal with him later on. Well, that looks like it's about it. Yeah. Oop. One little piece popped off. Well, as you can see, the model has been stripped down to its bare plastic, or it's going to be stripped down as much as I'm going to be able to get with this type of a solution, which, for the purposes of this build here, is more than suffice. Like we just saw, the model did receive some damage during the paint stripping process. This is not uncommon. Like I mentioned before, this process does do a little bit of a beating on the plastic parts, but luckily the parts that broke off appear to have broken off in a clean manner and appear to be a result of just old glue as opposed to the parts actually physically snapping off. All the components that popped off are located in this bucket over here, but are currently on the bottom of this pea soup type setup. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take the parts that I was able to get out of the solution, get them washed off with some water to get rid of the alcohol or residual alcohol that's left on the surface. As for the stuff in the bottom of the bucket here, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead, put the cap back on, let the sediment settle so that in a few hours I could go ahead, pop it off, and I'll be able to physically see the components on the bottom of the bucket, where and then I could strip them and clean them off further. And here go the stripped components now, laid out here on the table. These are the majority of the parts I was able to find. There may be one or two smaller parts still in the solution, but at the time of filming this, the solution sediment still hasn't fully set yet, so at the moment it's really hard to see if anything is still floating around in there. But as the build progresses and I come across details that I probably need, I'm pretty sure I'll be able to track them down at that point. Regardless, here go the majority of the components here strewn out on the table. As you can see, the model is really a pretty simple one. There's not really a whole lot going on here. A good number of the parts are still found on the vehicle itself, which will cut down on some of the work required in order to do the rebuild. Starting with the wheels, now that the paint is stripped off, they are in really good shape. A few of them do have some glue marks found on the tires. Presumably this is where the Lincoln Link track were affixed to the wheels, but fortunately this is something that's very easily addressed with some sandpaper and a needle file. Just a little bit of polishing and the pieces will be good to go. The idlers also have the same story to them. But again, just like with the wheels, they should clean up fairly easily. And the sprockets actually survived really well. The pieces just crumbled off of them in a nice, efficient manner. On the side skirts here, you'll see that not all of the paint was able to be scrubbed away in the solution, because I believe this paint here was applied with a tester's paint marker, which explains why they are still on here, because that paint is an enamel-based paint. However, the paint is on in such a fine, thin manner that it shouldn't be a problem when it comes for the model being repainted. On the fuel tanks, you'll notice that these also popped off of the build. This is just because of Tester's red tube glue being Tester's red tube glue, which is a good thing because now I could clean them up a bit, and it's easier for me to work on them while they're off of the model here. They're in pretty decent shape overall. This one here, the little axis hatch, has quite a substantial amount of glue caked onto the surface, but that's not going to be a problem because, like I stated before, jerry cans get fitted to this location over here, so it's going to work out towards the end of the build. The rear ramp here, nothing really much to talk about here other than it's going to have to be permanently affixed to the rear of the hatch, or to the rear of the vehicle, because the hinges are completely trashed, which is common, like I said before, on these older builds. Some other parts to mention are the tow missile system. Like I said before, or like I may have stated earlier, there are these two wings that come off of the rear section here, and these were really never glued on properly at first, so luckily, because of the glues being as old as they are, I was able to just simply pop them off nice and cleanly, so once the rebuild commences, these will finally be able to be taken care of. On the piece here, you can see some more glue marks that are found on the model, including 14-year-old John's fingerprint right there in the glue. Like I stated before, this is something that's going to be addressed when the build actually commences and digs in. And this now leads us to the hull, and this is really the main portion of the build that's going to require the majority of the revisions. On the side of the hull here, you can see that the hull has some pretty substantial grooves that are scrubbed into it, more likely from really coarse sandpaper. At the time, I really didn't understand the concept of properly sanding stuff down, so this is going to be polished away. Fortunately, this is not something that's going to be an issue. We could just, with a few passes of some medium and then fine sandpaper, this will be as smooth as it can be. Same thing is also true for the opposite side. The majority of the cleanup is going to be on the weld work, like I hinted to before, but fortunately on this build here, in order to make the job easier, the model decided to give me a break, and again, with red tube being red tube, the entire roof just popped right off. And I just want to take this opportunity to say, never use Tester's red tube model glue when you're building models. That stuff, although it's really cheap and for a while is extremely convenient, it is a terrible method for gluing together plastic models. Unless you're building them purposely bad at first so that you could revisit them years later. In that case, it's great for that. But this glue just did not hold up. And before anyone's wondering, saying, well, John, yeah, that's because you glued on a painted surface. Well, keep in mind, the gas cans here were glued onto just plastic on plastic, and they just popped right off of my hand. So, you know, take that for what you will. On the top deck here, you'll see that in addition to polishing away some of the rough weld marks, there are a few other glue stains found here on the surface. And again, these should polish up pretty well. A lot of these glue marks are locations where details get affixed to, so once the details are remounted, the thing is going to be pretty much cleaned up. Like I said before, I'm not expecting this rebuild to be really all that expansive, other than some minor polishing and some light repair work. On the hatch here, there are these two other points that are integrally molded in. They look like suggestion points for some other details, but on this vehicle here, I believe these are just a carryover from another type of 113 model, so I'm just going to sand those off with some sandpaper and I'll be good to go. The antenna base here is completely trashed. Like I said before, had that wire in it. I got rid of that wire. This is going to be polished away and I'm going to replace with one of my resin antenna bases, like I was hinting to earlier for the rear gas tanks. Here you can see some more of the clunk work that is going to need to be addressed. You can see some more of it over here. Looks pretty gnarly right now, but you know, if anyone has been watching these rebuild videos, you'll know that this is something that actually cleans up pretty easily. On the front here, we have the front hatch. This does have quite a bit of glue smeared on. But again, this was just done in order to secure the bow plane in place. And once everything is permanently glued together, it'll look basically seamless as it really needs to be. Like all the problems I mentioned earlier, the bow plane really wasn't one of them. So, one other thing on the suspension that needs to be addressed are some of the swing arms. They were glued on in a haphazard format, so I'm going to try to see if I could fix this. One of them did suffer some damage. This was just for me fiddling with it to see if I could pop it off, and this one decided that he wasn't having that, so that's going to have to be addressed. That's actually a very important aspect that has to be fixed. And the other thing I want to point out is with the final drives, and you guessed it, I made the mistake on this build as well, where I glued the spindle to the final drive and making it as one solid piece. Now, like I've stated in the other Tamiya pattern M113 videos, the way these kits are designed is that this spindle is supposed to spin freely inside of this space. And the way it works is you have the sprocket, and you put a drop of glue on the inside of that hole there, and then you secure that little axle to the sprocket, and then when the glue's set, this piece then can fully rotate. Well, on this build here, I did the same mistake that I've made on literally every single Tamiya pattern M113s that have been showcased on the channel thus far, where I glued it in place and then I mounted the final drives to the model. And because of that, the spindle is rock solid. Now, normally this is something that I would address. I would cut this guy off, drill him out, and then put in a 1/8 of an inch steel shaft. But on this one here, I don't think that's going to be really necessary, honestly, because the sprockets are held on in a much tighter fashion than they are on the Tamiya ones that I've done in the past. So, honestly, I don't think that modification is going to be necessary on this one. On the Tamiya ones, when the sprockets are on and you improperly assemble the final drive, these pieces just want to pop right off. And once you put the track tension on, it just yanks them right off the model. On this one here, I don't think that's going to be the case, but, you know, we'll see as the build progresses. Okay, so now that you can see exactly what I have to work with over here, enough with the deconstruction. Now let's go ahead and start with the actual rebuilding and revision process. Well, one great benefit that this build here has over the other OTR builds in the lineup is that this one, I actually have the original set of instructions that came with this model when I first built it all those years ago. I was able to track it down miraculously in my instruction file cabinet, and with these in hand, I can easily pick up where I left off, and there shouldn't be any guesswork to which parts go where. So here's the side with the bodywork completed. On the opposite side, I still need to utilize the same procedure because you see those gouges found on the side, plus some glue marks. First, I'm going to hit it with some 150 grit sandpaper. This is going to basically level off the surface, remove the glue marks, as well as also polish down as much as possible the remainder of the surface. This is in anticipation for the wet sanding that's going to be done with the higher grit sandpaper. And here you can see the wet sanding process in operation. The sandpaper I'm using is 220 grit. I basically just dip it in some water and I just start rubbing it up and down the surface. This does a fantastic job with blending everything in, removing the original gouge lines, as well as also polishing up the other sanding marks that I did with the coarser grain sandpaper. As you can see, if I wipe the surface clean with my finger, you're not going to see any traces whatsoever of the other procedures. When you're done, it leaves for a really good result, and it's one that really doesn't take that long. I believe this was about 5 minutes in total to accomplish.
Wax on, wax off.
With the sides out of the way, I can focus on the top portion here, where you can see some glue marks as well as also the chewed up nick lines left over from the Bosch welding job that I mentioned before. To start, I'm going to use the orange sandpaper to just go up and down these surfaces here in a nice smooth manner, which will do a good job with removing the glue as well as also sanding away and leveling out the surface left over from the nick lines. The nick lines are pretty shallow on the surface, so the removal of a small bit of material is not going to be noticeable, or is it going to hurt the overall side appearance of the hull. For this procedure, I prefer the coarser grit sandpaper opposed to the finer grit stuff. The coarser grit does a better job with removal of material, while the finer stuff is better used for blending in. The only trick though is that when you're going over these surfaces here, you want to do it in an even square manner. If you apply too much pressure to the left or to the right, you can have the problem where you're going to remove more material from those ends and it's going to throw off the squareness of the vehicle's hull. On an M113 here, this is extremely important. Okay, well, outside of that, right now you can see me sanding down the rear area for the ramp. There were a lot of glue chunks and putty chunks that are remaining in this area. So in order to help the top deck fit back on, I need to go ahead and polish these down. Obviously, I'm using the same sandpaper method that I showed before. I'm just going up and down these surfaces very gently and lightly in order to remove the amount of material to square everything off. The front hull in comparison has got to be done a different way. Because of the front plate being installed on, I cannot pluck it off in order to use the sandpaper procedure. So in its place, I'm going to be utilizing this flat needle file that we have here. I'm just going to be going up and down these surfaces here until the ridges are removed. One advantage though about this procedure is that because of the way the M113 hull is shaped, you kind of have a standoff from the front plate and the side plate, and this acts as a perfect guide track in order to run the needle file up and down. After a few passes, it does a marvelous job with squaring everything off. Of course, the same procedure is done on the opposite side, where it's a little bit easier because the length of the panel is full length and it does a better job in guiding the needle file. Because of the engine hatch situation on the reverse side, you do have to be a little bit more careful towards the top edge. Of course, afterwards, a little swipe or two of the finer grit sandpaper doesn't hurt, and it really does a good job in blending in any sort of remnants that remain. So the front plate here was a complete utter mess. The front plate was covered and caked in both glue as well as green putty, and all of this needs to be polished away. To do this, the sandpaper method was the best avenue to take. The sandpaper did a very good job with getting rid of all of that clunk that I mentioned. Also, some of the parts on the front were improperly mounted originally, where, for instance, the smoke grenade launchers are on upside down, and also those little boxes are in their improper locations. Luckily, red tube glue was handy again because the piece just popped right off without any problems, and that allowed me to then go ahead and polish down the remainder of the surfaces. However, while doing the sanding on the front, the one area that was always a big pain on these M113s is that front axis panel that's right there, right next to the engine hatch. A lot of care has to be exhibited during the sanding procedure because obviously you don't want to ruin any of the small detailing that is integrally molded onto that part. So with a little bit of careful sanding, I was able to work around that bit of detailing and left it unscathed. The next most important area to concentrate on was that little weld that the engine hatch closes onto. There was an excessive amount of glue found in this location, and just for the hatch to sit on flush, all of this had to have been removed. To do this, I'm using a Dremel with a small high-speed removal bit, and this is basically acting like an end mill on a milling machine, but this is being all done freehand. This is the type of procedure where you really need to have some really good experience with working with tools like this, as well as also an extremely steady hand. Fortunately, I was able to accomplish the task without any problems. Afterwards, a X-Acto was used just to remove any sort of remnants that remain. Jumping to the rear, the extended fuel tanks were mounted improperly, like I touched upon before, and they were yanked off after the paint stripping process. They were not a clean break, however, and there was still some glue fragments as well as some plastic fragments that were found on the rear hull. These were polished away with a needle file, which was done off camera, but here you can see me scraping away the other amendments that are found close to the lip over there for the rear ramp. Obviously, a lot of care has to be exhibited at this point because that rim is absolutely important and you don't want to remove that with any sort of overzealous sanding. Jumping to the roof, this is probably the worst of the damage that needs to be fixed in order to get this model up and going again. I'm pointing out all the clunk that's found on the sides where we have a mixture of glue as well as green putty, and all this needs to go. First, I'm going to be hitting it with some sandpaper just to smooth off all of the edges, and this is actually going to really assist when it comes time for mounting the roof back onto the model. The sides are absolutely crucial to get right at this point, because then I'm going to be able to turn my attention to the removal of the other clunk that's on the surface. And this needs to be done very cautiously, again, because of all the little details that are found on the top portion of this vehicle's roof. After a little bit of fine tweaking here and there with the sandpaper, I go ahead and test the fit on the body, and as you can see, it fits on absolutely perfectly. The only other thing I do want to fix at this time here is if we notice here on the front, we have a little gouge found in this portion over here. What more than likely happened was when I was freeing this plate off of the sprue, I believe there was probably a little tab on this section, and I may have overzealously removed too much material, which leaves for this chunk here. As a kid, it looked like I tried to compensate for that by adding a chunk of, or I should say a plump of green putty over here and try to sculpt that in, but it didn't really work out too well and just left for the area to be pretty chunky. However, now that everything is removed, you can see that that gouge is still remaining. So this is going to be something I am going to take care of at this point now, specifically since the top and the side hull here are two separate pieces. And how am I going to fix this, you may ask? Well, simple. I'm going to use the same procedure that I used on the 1/72nd scale Tiger Models M981 Tusk tank that I built a couple years ago. If anyone's seen that video, that model was probably one of the first small-scale rebuilds that I've actually done a video for, where it had large gouges of side sections removed from the hull due to a side skirt being improperly glued on. In that video, I take a portion discussing the procedure on which I used to repair the missing sections and polish it away, giving it for a appearance that is much more appropriate compared to the way it was before. And I'm going to use the same procedure here, which will include a small strip of Plastruct, a little bit of glue, and also some red putty. The first important step is to cut a piece of Plastruct to the shape and size. This is going to be a backing that is going to be glued to the inside portion of the panel that has the gouge that needs to be removed. The panel needs to be installed absolutely perfectly so that it adheres to the panel in question, but it doesn't inhibit the top plate that needs to be sandwiched on top. This is absolutely crucial because this is what's actually going to support the putty when it gets applied. Because of the size of the gash, you can't just use putty alone because it'll just fall inside of the model, or it'll just crack off during the sanding process. But if it's on a plastic backing like this, you have some rigidity to it, and it'll leave for a better surface to apply and sand down the putty. So here's the putty getting applied. I'm using the same red putty that I've touched upon in a few of my other videos. This stuff here is basically the same as the Squadron Green putty, but you get more of it and it costs less. The putty itself is applied, you let it fully set and dry, and then once it's done, you can polish away with the sandpaper like you see me doing here. Once it's done, the results are really, really good, and as you can see, the part is basically good as new. With the hull out of the way, I'm turning my attention to the rear extended fuel tanks. These received quite a bit of damage. First, you can see me adjusting the surface texture on them. During the original build, they have a lot of green putty and glue marks found on the surface, and these of course need to go before I could even address the other damage. The removal is done with the two sandpaper method that I touched upon before, where you can see the red sandpaper here getting rid of the bulk of the mess, and then the black sandpaper is going to take care of the final texturing and the surface. On these gas tanks here, you can see how the bottom portion is heavily chewed up on them. This was from the extraction process, where the brake wasn't exactly clean and there are some chunks left over on the rear plate. These were addressed in the previous scene. You could also see me chipping away some of the green putty that was left from an ill-fated attempt at seam removal, but the piece is cleaned up fairly well. To address the big gorges that are found on the side, I'm going to be using the same red putty method that I touched upon in the previous scene. I already have the plastruct piece to size. I'm clipping it here, gluing it on, and then I could go ahead and start adding the putty for the exact same reasons that I just touched upon earlier. With the red putty drying, I need to focus on the top portion of the one fuel tank. There's this little conduit running along the leading edge, as you can see here, and this didn't survive on one of the other fuel tanks because of the amount of glue that had to have been removed. To replace it, I used this piece here of strip styrene. It's a simple piece to refabricate, so the styrene should do a good job with replicating that missing detail. I went ahead and trimmed it to shape and glued it on. Once the glues are fully set, I could refine it further, giving it the look that it had originally. Of course, after the sanding is all done, it's time to install the new modified fuel tanks to the rear of the M113. Here you can see me just placing it on nice and carefully. Now this is where I screwed up originally, where the alignment was off, and I also tried to blend everything in. However, on the real vehicles with these fuel tanks, there is a seam line present on these locations. Here you can see me test fitting it with a side skirt just to see if everything works out, and lo and behold, it does. And of course, the same procedure is done to the opposite fuel tank with the same results. With the fuel tanks out of the way, the rear ramp is finally installed onto place in a permanent manner, and once everything is set and done, we're basically done with the back and can progress further with the remainder of the build. I also went ahead and did some other things off camera, which I'll touch upon in a moment, but before I do, the only thing I want to point out is that the last remaining bits that are going to be fitted to this model at this point to get it ready for painting is I need to add the missing smoke grenades that we have right here, as well as repair the busted exhaust brush guard that we have in this little section over here. The other details that are needing to be fitted are going to be the antenna bases, which are going to be added momentarily. Starting with the model's off-camera mods brings us to the toe points. Now, of course, the kit supplies you with these details, and one of them were still found on this model at the start of the build. The other one, some point in time, must have fallen off, and sadly that piece is forever gone. Now, normally I would take the existing unit and make a mold out of it so that I can cast identical replacements. However, the unit wasn't really able to be salvaged. It was so encrusted with glues, and the piece was basically gone. So rather than going with the mold route, I simply just replaced them altogether with two new units fabricated out of pieces of styrene. While on a similar note of making a mold, as you can see here, the smoke grenades have not yet been mounted to this cluster. And that is because I did not have enough of the original pieces on hand in order to mount them on. I have 4 of the original units found on this side, but the other ones I wasn't able to track down. So what I went ahead and did was I took the existing units and I made a silicone mold that we have over here. I'm going to go ahead and cast the components out of resin, which will then be mounted directly in place, and once everything is painted, they're going to look identical to the original ones that were made out of polystyrene. Now, in case anyone's wondering, why haven't I mounted the front bow plane to the front plate here of the hull at this point? Well, the answer is pretty simple. This is going to be fitted after the model gets its coat of primer, because once this piece gets mounted in, you're going to see that you're not going to be able to get into this rear section over here, and it's going to leave for an exposed area. So after the model goes into its primer and possibly even the base coat, that's when this unit will be dropped in place, and then I could progress with the remainder of the paintwork. Moving from the hull now takes to the turret components. Now the turret components here are heading into their refinement phase where I'm polishing away and removing any sort of glue mark imperfections that were found on several other of the locations on the model surface. These little wings here have been cleaned up. I briefly touched upon them earlier, but now that they have been polished down and the glue marks have been sanded away, they are ready for installation. The remainder of the tow missile body here, you can see, has some glue marks found on the surface. Nothing too egregious, but it is something I'm going to polish away with some sandpaper just to make sure that the surface is nice and smooth. Moving our way to the lower portion of the turret, this also has been going through its revision process, cleaning up some of the subassembly glue marks that I had on this model when I first built it. You can see that right here on the back. It's been polished down quite a bit, and the unit now is much more refined. This brings us, however, to this arm. You'll see that this arm I had a little bit of an issue with. You see, when I first built the model, the piece was, for one reason or another, canted, and it was to a point where it was bugging me. So I used a technique that really I shouldn't have done. I kind of went against my own better judgment on it, and it's one I'm going to mention because it's a cautionary tale and I don't want to see anyone else make. One technique that I used in order to straighten the piece out was I hit it briefly with a heat gun, which softens the plastic and gives you a little bit of pliability. Now, this technique is really best suited for resin components because with resin you can actually do that. You can hit it with a heat gun, it'll soften up, and you can actually straighten it if the piece is bent in one direction or another. Well, you can do a similar trick with plastic, but plastic does have some problems. Namely, when you hit it with a heat gun, not only does it become soft, but it starts crinkling and really deforming on you. And really, well, I was able to straighten the piece out. As you can see, it looks pretty good now, but sadly the detailing here had some severe deformalities because of the procedure. Again, I'm just mentioning this because it's something that I don't want to see other people do, so if you are running into this technique, don't use the heat gun unless it's an extremely last resort. So fortunately, it's not terminal because I am going to polish it up. Basically, that molding and detailing, like we see over here, was sanded away with a needle file, and the area was filled in with the red putty. The red putty is going to fill in all the catering that was occurred from the deformation, and now I'm going to sand it down with some needle files and some sandpaper in order to level it off. As for the detailing, I'm either going to do one of two options. The one option is to just fabricate a new piece here out of a stock of resin. I turn it on the lathe and it'll give me the shape. However, you're not going to have those little fine details on it. Another technique is I actually went ahead and made a clay mold of this section over here. Let me show you what that looks like. And this is a clay mold. What a clay mold is quite simply put, it's just a lump of clay with a little recess that is your actual mold. This piece here is made from just a lump of clay. You could use Play-Doh. In my case here, I'm using plasticine oil-based clay because it's what I have in the shop. This is the type of thing that you can do if you are really in a quick little bind and you want to make a replacement component, but you don't want to go ahead and go the full Monty route with making a whole rubber mold for one reason or another. Clay molding does have some benefits, namely one, it's extremely fast. You don't have to wait for rubber to set. You just take the lump of clay, you press it onto the surface, pop it off, and you have your imprint found on the surface. From here, you just take a little drop of resin, put it into that section. Once it fully sets, you remove the clay, wash off any residual clay found on the piece, and you're good to go. However, the technique does have some drawbacks. Namely, one is that it's really susceptible to deformation. You see, when you are pressing the clay onto the surface and when you're popping it off, a lot of times the clay will stick to the surface and you may have to pry on the piece to remove it, which can cause a bend, and this will lead to a deformation. Obviously, deformations will lead to results that are less than desirable. Another problem is that clay molds tend not to be very well detailed with the way the pieces are molded. This has to do with the way the piece is stamped onto the clay. Just a lot of times, if there's any impurities or other issues with the clay, it can cause for a substandard cast. But again, one of the advantages is that if you have a piece that you're not happy with, you could just rinse, wash, and repeat because it's basically an instantaneously made mold. You don't have to, again, let rubber set or anything along those lines. This is a technique that honestly I haven't done in a little while, but it's one that I have used in the past and actually came to be quite handy and has saved me on a number of builds that I've done over the years. So it's definitely, it's not one of the tools in your toolbox that you'll use all the time, or it's not one that you'll default to right away, but it is a good technique to have in case, again, you run into a bind or a situation like I have here. So here's the resin now applied to the clay. Right now I'm carefully peeling the casted component off, and once I go ahead and have the piece without the bulk of the clay on it, it's then time to wash off the remainder. This is done by just putting the piece in a cup and just pouring some paint thinner inside. Plasticine clay is very susceptible to paint thinner, so a few swirls later the piece is cleaned off, as you see right now. At this point, of course, now it's time for final assembly. And once it's all said and done, the piece basically looks indistinguishable from the one on the opposite side. On the top assembly here, you can see these two wells, and they have a considerable amount of glue in there. There's no technique I had that can polish these out because of their location, but rather than trying to get rid of them, I'm just going to plate it over with a thin strip here of sheet styrene. The styrene is just going to go into the well, and once added, it's going to conceal the pools of glue and leave for a nice smooth end result. Well, once the last of the detail fittings are fitted, the model is now ready to go into paint and, of course, slide into completion. Here you can see the model here, and by the way, this is what it would look like when the tow missile is in its transport mode. That's why we have these extra appendages found here on the rear deck. Now, one thing I want to touch upon is with the way the turret mounts to the hull. On this version here of the Academy kit, I always found that the turret is held on in a very flimsy manner. It's almost as if they want you to glue the turret to the upper hull. If you notice, there are no turret locks or any other provisions found on either piece here to secure it to the vehicle. The neck itself is very, very shallow, and the bearing surface here is very loose. Not loose where it'll wobble, but it's just not enough to really secure the piece to the vehicle. However, one thing I did notice on this model when I first originally built it is that after the model slides into paint and gets a few layers of paint buildup on both of these sections over here, it does do a decent job with holding the turret to the hull, but it's not a really secure type fitting. So this is one of those things where if you have this kit, and I'm not sure if the Vulcan version of the Academy kit is any different, but if you have this rendition here, this is something you might want to keep in mind as your build is progressing. Before I go ahead and get the model into paint, I went ahead and took the tow missile assembly off of the lower portion here of the turret. This was just done so that it makes it easier for me to get access to paint. Obviously, with a unit like this, where you have a lot of these complex shapes and ingresses over here, this can cause some problems if the unit is fully assembled because of all these little nooks and crannies. Trying to get the paint to flow into these areas is something that can be an issue, specifically if it's all clustered and cluttered together. To avoid paint gap, just like what I mentioned before with the front, it's best to paint these pieces in this type of configuration. And when it comes time for actually painting, this is the type of thing that everyone has their own way on doing it. You know, you'll ask 4 or 5 different people and you will literally get 4 or 5 different responses. You know, there's a lot of YouTube tutorials out there. Some are pretty good. Some, it might not be for you. And honestly, it's the type of thing where just try it on your own and see, you know, what works best for your techniques. Now, for my builds, I tend to avoid some of the more specialty color brands out there. Like, I don't use MIG, I don't use AK. I've seen some of their tutorials out there, and it's just, again, it's just not something that I could see myself utilizing. Now, I'll touch upon the brands of paints that I use in a moment, but one thing that I do need to do before I can do any of that is I need to prep the surfaces of all these plastic parts here. You see, no matter really what paint that you use, you can't just take the paint straight from the bottle, throw it onto the surface, and expect to build upon it from there. You can do it sometimes, I've done in the past, but within the last about decade or so, I moved away from that to the method I'm using now, and I've been having some pretty good results with it. This was one of the things I learned over the years, is that if the model surface does have a coat of primer added to it, the base coat and the subsequent coatings of paint will adhere a lot better to the surfaces if they are coated with some kind of a primer coat, as opposed to having the paint get applied to bare plastic. And this is where you'll run into different techniques if you ask different people. Some individuals, they like to use some specialty primers, either an etch primer or this type of company's primer. You know, they come in little specialty rattle cans, or it's in a bottle and you airbrush it on. And that is all well and good. However, for my builds, I'm a bit more utilitarian on the paints that I use for my primer. Rather than using any of those, I just go with, well, a regular low-budget rattle can of El Cheapo flat black spray paint. This color here is sold in Home Depots, but basically any hardware store that you will go into will have their own brand of flat black. Walmart does this as well, and these cans are literally like, I don't know, 75 cents, if that. So they're really, really cheap, really easy to find, but are pretty good in their quality for this type of procedure. The paints apply very evenly to the surface, and they don't cause any damages to the base plastic materials. Now note, I am referring specifically to the cheap cans of spray paint here. If you start using the more name brand paints, you may run into some issues, and plus it does cost more. So for my primer needs, El Cheapo Flat Black is the way to go. Along the lines of the primer, another question that I frequently get asked is, John, do you use, red oxide, or do you use primer gray for some of your builds? And the answer is pretty simple. For my 1/35 scale static models, I basically exclusively use the flat black method. Very rarely do I use those other colors on those builds. That's generally if I'm trying to do something different with the paint pattern, like for instance on the Luva, when I had the turret all left in its primer red coloring, or when I do my gun barrels on my German tanks and I leave them with the gray coloring. That's generally the only time when I play around with different colors for the primer. Other than that, flat black is the way to go for my static 135s. Now, for anyone who's a fan of my larger scale content, you'll notice that I generally use either red oxide or equipment gray primer for both of those builds. And the reason why you'll see it on those is because generally on those models they tend to be radio controlled, and I like having either the red or the gray underneath, because if the paint scratches, you'll see that red oxide come out, and it just makes it look a little bit better as opposed to having, other colors underneath. And again, a typical question I ask is, John, well, which color do you use? Do you use gray or red, for this build or that build? And the answer is pretty simple. It's really whatever I can find in stock en masse at a given time. Sometimes there's a sale on gray primers, and other times there's a sale on red primers. And depending on what I'm doing, I'll just, stock up on one color or another. However, realistically, the color of the primer isn't all that important. It's, of course, just a base for the real base coat color to stick to. So, hopefully that answers a lot of questions I typically get asked in these videos. So, back to the model at hand. Like I said before, I'm utilizing this can of flat black spray paint, where I'll go ahead and evenly coat the surfaces of this model, getting them prepared for the base coat. Of course, when it comes to the spray paints, just like with all paints, you want to go with nice, even, thin coats. You don't want to overdo it to avoid drips and other imperfections that generally can be seen if you overdo it with the paint. So, generally it takes about 2, maybe 3 coats of the flat black just to get everything thoroughly coated. And then once you're at that point, then you can progress with the remainder of the paintwork. So, let's cut across to when the model is all in its primer and about to receive its coat of base. Well, after the model is spray painted, at this point here, it is ready to progress further with its base coat and then later on its camouflage. However, before I do, I want to go ahead and take the opportunity to show the model's surfaces now, and you can see exactly how much the model has been cleaned up from the way it looked originally when I first started the build. Note all of those glue marks and fingerprints which were found on several of the surfaces have been removed and polished away. And also note the side portions here that were heavily chewed up originally from the welding procedure that I did have all been undone, and the model now looks much more presentable compared to the way it did before. And for the lower portion here of the turret, if we can recall, this piece was heavily warped from the heating process, and I went ahead and revised it like I illustrated previously, and now that it's fully painted, you can see how much better it looks. So like I stated before, for this one I'm going to go with a 3-tone NATO camouflage pattern, much along the lines that it had originally. For the colors, when it comes to NATO tri-scheme, probably the best colors that are out there are the ones from Tamiya, where they have all 3 of the color shades from the NATO green, NATO black, and the NATO brown. These colors are a perfect tint and are ones that I use myself and are highly recommended, specifically if you're going with a NATO type camouflage pattern. However, for the base coat, I'm not going to be utilizing Tamiya NATO green, per se. You see, one trick that I learned years ago is that if you use a certain type of color repeatedly, say for instance NATO Green or Dunkelgelb, rather than purchasing the little bottles, which after a while, you know, you can only get so many usage out of something this small, and if you build a lot of models like I do, purchasing, you know, bottle after bottle after bottle can get expensive after a while. So rather than going with that approach, I went ahead and actually took the Tamiya paint, made a little color swatch, had it scanned at the Home Depot, and from there I have, boom, a 1 gallon form of the said paint. This here is exterior latex. It's the color that I've used on many, many builds that are showcased on this channel, specifically when I do a lot of 1/6 scale stuff, because obviously this here can go a lot further compared to painting an entire 1/6 scale model with just these. This can here I had mixed about, going on 10 years ago now, when I was utilizing a lot of this paint for various projects. So we go ahead and pour it out into this little cup here and begin the painting. Paint here is a little bit on the thicker end. It has been diluted over the years from constant use, but a few drops of water couldn't hurt. So I'm just going to pour a little bit back into the can. Not going to need a whole lot. It's just a 1/35 scale model after all. To dilute it, I just use standard tap water. I don't use anything fancy like alcohol or anything along those lines. You can, if it works best for you, but for me, just regular tap water seems to do the trick. Now, if you're trying to dilute it and you accidentally dilute it too much, fear not. Literally just dump it back into the paint can, shake it a little bit, and then pour it out, and you should be able to pick up right where you left off. So it's very forgivable in that respect. But with the thinness that I have here, I think this should be suffice for what I need it for. To actually apply the paint, I use my Pashi double action airbrush. This is the same airbrush that has been discussed in many of my videos, from my 1/6 scale builds to my other 1/35 scale rebuild videos. If you're a fan of the channel, this is the airbrush that I use for just about everything. However, the airbrush is just half the story, because you need something to propel air into it in order to get the airbrush to work. When it comes to airbrushing, there's two options that you can go with. One is a can of Propel, which is a aerosol can full of CO2 gas. You just screw the fitting on and you have air ready to go. And the other is with an air compressor. The CO2 air cans I don't like, because you're limited to how much PSI is going to be in that tiny little can. Those are really good in case you're on the road for whatever reason and you need to do some quick touch-ups. Something like that can come in handy. But for basically 99.999% of model usage, you're going to go with an air compressor. It'll be a lot better for you. And it's also cheaper in just about all respects. When it comes to air compressors, this opens up a complete can of worms, because there are a ton of different options out there, as well as different fittings and features, all of which depend really on what you need your air compressor for. When it comes to plastic model airbrush compressors, generally most people out there, they go to a store of one flavor or another, like a Hobby Lobby or a hobby shop, or they go on Amazon, they buy a consumer grade airbrush air compressor. Something akin to like Easy Air or something along those lines. The problem is with those units is that, in my opinion, they are underpowered and are really a waste of money for what they are and what they give you, performance-wise. This is why whenever I get asked a question on what type of air compressor or airbrush to buy, I always tell them to buy a tool-type air compressor. And what I mean by that is generally one that has a tank to it. From a 5-gallon or a 10-gallon unit, these air compressors can be found in any hardware store or even a place like Big Lots. And with just a change of 1 or 2 fittings on them, which are, you know, a couple bucks a piece, you can get a system which will give you much better performance for a price tag that is generally sometimes lower than some of those consumer grade units. Another benefit that this machine here has over those small little Easy Air counterparts is versatility. Those machines are generally meant exclusively for airbrushing, while one of these type of units, you can do other things besides just airbrushing small plastic models. And a air compressor is always a good tool to have in your garage. You can fill up your car tire, your bicycle tire. If you have a party, you can fill up balloons. And if during the summertime, you could use it to fill up things like inflatable rafts and such. So one of these units here are a good investment to have in your toolbox. This machine here is a 30-gallon stand-up unit and is overkill for most people's air compressor needs. Like I stated before, if you're looking for a good air compressor, anywhere between 5 or 10 gallons should give you enough power for what you need for most air compressor usage. Obviously, this machine here is the one that I use in my shop, which you can easily tell from the outward appearance of it. It is heavily used, and I use it for all of my resin casting needs. I use it to clean up molds prior to casting, and I also use it to pressurize my castings, which eliminates all the little air bubbles that you see on poor quality resin parts out there. The machine, though, outside of resin casting use, I also use it to airbrush all of my models, from my 1/6 scale builds to my 1/35 scale builds, all of which have air coming out of this unit that we have here. And the magic, of course, is with this little dial. This is why these machines are better compared to those little crappy ones that I just mentioned, because you can custom set the air to whatever PSI you want. You want more power, it's on tap. You want to turn that back for some small delicate type airbrushing, you can do that easily as well with just a flick of a wrist. Okay, so I went ahead and filled up my paint cup. I don't need to add any more water to it to dilute it any further because it is already on the thin side. Might be slightly too thin, we'll see once I start painting it. So at this point now I'm going to put on my respirator. In case anyone's wondering, this is the respirator that I use. I don't use those particle masks that they sell in hardware stores and the carpentry aisles. Those masks are really piss poor at blocking anything. Okay, so you can see that the paint is at the perfect consistency for airbrushing. And at this point here, I'm actually going to go ahead and set the model aside and do one of the most important things you can do when it comes to model building, and that is let it dry. So I'm going to go ahead, set this guy aside so that the paints can fully set, and at that point there I can flip it over and continue with the remainder of the paintwork. While this guy here is set aside, I'm going to go ahead and work on applying the paint to the other components, namely the missile system, as well as the running gear. So we don't really need to get that on camera, so I'm going to go ahead and cut across to when the model has its base coat completed and we're ready for its camouflage. Alright, well, here we have the model now with its base coat of NATO green. From here, it's ready for the camouflage. Now, like I said before, for the camo, I used Tamiya for that. And the color is the Tamiya XF69 NATO Black. It's right here in this cup. Add a few drops of water to it just to dilute it a little bit further. And from here I can go ahead and airbrush it onto the model. For the application, like I said before, I'm utilizing my double action Pashi airbrush. When it comes to airbrushes, I exclusively like double action. Single action, in my opinion, it doesn't give you as much control as the double. I just like the double action way more. You get way more finer gradation of the flow as well as with the paint mix, and you can play around with different options to get different effects. Well, here's the camouflage pattern now applied, but it's not necessarily perfect just yet. There is a little bit of overspray in some certain locations, and there are a few other small areas I want to improve slightly. Now, this is the point of the camouflage that's called feathering. Feathering is literally what entails what I just described. You take a color of one sort or another, and you go ahead and you refine the pattern a little bit further until the point where you tweak it to where you like it. For the feathering, I'm going to go ahead and just add a little bit of green in one or two locations, as well as in some of the overspray spots like here on the lower. But other than that, this one here doesn't really need a whole lot of it, so we're fortunate in that respect. And after all that work, here's the project now fully completed. Let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. Starting with the model's running gear and track, one of the biggest running gags of this whole video was just how crappy the original Lincoln Link tracks were. Well, like I stated before, one of the biggest changes and revisions that was going to be made to this build was to swap those out with a set of single-piece vinyl tracks from AFV Club. The AFV Club tracks, detail-wise, are excellent, as I showcased before, but here you get to see what they look like now fitted to the model. When it came time to mount the tracks to the model, my opinion is that they are okay at best. They could have been better, however, they are still orders of magnitude superior to the original crap individual Lincoln length that we saw at the beginning of the video. One interesting quirk that I noticed that these tracks do have is that they were one link too long, and this is a interesting quirk because I ran into the same exact quirk on the M4A3E8 rebuild that I posted a little while ago. On that build, I also used a set of single-piece vinyl tracks from AFV Club. In order to shorten the tracks on that model, I also did the same technique on this one, where I shortened it one link. The link that was cut away was the joining link. Basically, it's that section that plugs together, securing the band as one piece. By cutting off the section on each side, this removed one whole link, and then I was able to just butt the two halves together and CA them as one piece. One nice attribute about this material here is that it super glues very, very easily and efficiently. Because of that, once the CA hardened, I was able to mount the tracks onto the model as I would with any other build. Once secured to the model, they are, again, more than capable enough for the job at hand. Of course, for painting them, it's the same procedure that I mentioned on all the other post-World War II American tank builds, where the M113 tracks are a mix between metal and rubber components. As for how to paint them, well, I go over that in more detail in my other M113 videos that are showcased on this channel. Moving up takes to the front hull detailing. Here you can see what the model looks like with all these details now fully fleshed out and painted. Last time we saw them, everything was just still in raw plastic, and there were some putty and glue marks here or there. But now that everything is fully repainted, you can see how good the bodywork was accomplished. Namely, on these side portions over here, note all of those chewed up lines are completely blended away. And also, the smoke grenade clusters are mounted right side up this time, as opposed to when I first built the model, where I mounted them on upside down. On this corner over here, I just want to point out that area where you saw me do the body work before. And now that the model is fully painted, you can see how it blends in absolutely effortlessly. And unless I mentioned it, you would have never realized that there was a little bit of body work going on in that location. While on this area, you can see the brush guard that has been fabricated on the exhaust manifold. This was fabricated out of a strip of thin aluminum. It's basically made from soda can metal, and I carefully cut it to the appropriate thinness and bent it to shape, as well as fabricating the other support struts that you see here. This detailing here really fills in the look and looks much better compared to the broken plastic one that we saw at the beginning of the video. Moving rearward takes us to the extended fuel tanks, and as we saw earlier, these two details here receive an extensive amount of work in order to repair as well as also refine. Now that they have been remounted to the model, you can see the seam lines which are present on either side, which would be found on the real vehicle, as well as you cannot see any of the repaired areas that were used to repair those chewed up sections found on the edges here on either side. The unit's cleaned up extremely well, and as we can also recall, one of the top portions had that piece of plastruct added in order to replicate that detailing that was lost during the refinement process. Also on this area here, you can see the one jerry can. As we mentioned before, the jerry can that was originally supplied with the model was heavily deformed due to the amount of glue that was originally used. That one was not kept. Instead, I replaced it with this unit here. This one here was a spare from an Italeri LEV25 model that I recently completed, and rather having it languish away in the spare bin, it was just simply dropped directly in place on the location that you see here. Moving up takes us to the antenna bases, and as we can recall, the original antenna bases were horribly botched on this build, where I fabricated these coiled spring type systems, and those were the first thing jettisoned when I went ahead and did the rebuild process. The antennas you see here are the rested ones that I touched upon earlier, as well as I've mentioned them in a few other videos. The new antenna bases were simply mounted on top of the freshly cleaned up platforms, and then the wires you see here are just thin pieces of fluoro wire that have been added to give you the detailing. On painting them, one of my viewers, which by the way, thanks for the tip, went ahead and reminded me that on vehicles from the modern era, on these systems here, the spring section would be painted in NATO black and the wire itself would be NATO green. On this one here, since this vehicle is from that era, I went ahead and painted them in the format that I just mentioned. On the third antenna base, notice this one is antenna wireless. With the real antennas, the wire is something that can be disconnected from the spring housing itself. So it's not uncommon to see the unit with its base and spring present. However, the antenna not fully fitted. For this one here, since I already have the two with their antennas on the back portion, for this one, I just went ahead and left it wireless. Also in the rear area, you can see the mounts for the gantry system, and these units are the travel lock where the unit can go ahead and rest upon them in the stowed state. One thing to mention is that all of these units here have rubber tips on them to prevent marring from when the unit makes contact with them. Same is also true for these two standoffs on either side here. These, though, are for the large rear hatch to not mar up when it opens up in the fully open state. Also on this area, you can see the Pioneer tools. These are the same ones that were showcased earlier at the beginning of the build, but here they have been repainted in the format that you see here. One thing that I do want to mention is that on modern military vehicle tools, the handles are painted with the NATO green, and for this build here, I just went ahead and mimicked that. These straps, of course, are painted in olive green just to give them a little bit more differentiation, just to prevent everything from blending in. Plus, the olive green is also a color used for webbing on military vehicles from the Cold War all the way up to the modern era. It's another quick way to give your model a little bit of differentiation as opposed to having everything blended in with the same color. On the rear hatch here, the unit is still fully functional. I went ahead and painted the inside. However, obviously there is no interior detailing present on this model, but it's just one of those why not features that this model does have. Moving forward to the turret, sadly during the rebuild process, the hinge system did not hold up and just basically fell apart. The hinges you see here are just detail pieces I fabricated out of thin pieces of styrene and mounted them in place. However, the hatch itself is permanently glued in the closed state, but again, since this model does not have any interior, really nothing of value was lost. Moving along takes us to what I erroneously referred to earlier as the tow missile system housing. In actuality, the M981 FISTV is an unarmed vehicle and is actually not for that purpose. The FISTV is actually used as an artillery observation vehicle, and it utilizes a series of very high-tech optics mounted in this housing over here in order to observe targets that are going to be used for artillery. The reason why it has this type of styling of housing is to conceal the purpose of this vehicle, where if any casual observer sees it, they mis-ID it for the M901 Hammerhead tow missile system. And I must say that the deception works extremely well, because even I myself was unaware of the vehicle's true intention up until the very tail end of this rebuild. When I was weathering the model, I was about to add a little bit of black soot weathering on the front section over here for the missile exhaust. And then when I went to look at the back, I realized, something's wrong. There's no tail section for the missile exhaust to blow out of. At that point, I stopped with the weathering. I looked in the instructions, read the brief history of the vehicle, went online, looked at the vehicle up on the internet, and lo and behold, I had something completely different than I thought I had for all 20-something years I've had this model. So rather than weathering it, I actually went ahead and painted all of the lenses on all the optics, which are molded on the kit's components and are found on this model. With a careful paintbrush, I went in here and added the gloss black as well as the lacquer to all these sections. It's pretty hard to see with this lighting situation I have here, but all of the optics were appropriately painted. So again, it's basically a happy accident that I have this model instead of the traditional tow missile equipped variant of the M113, which means someone at the end of this video is going to be scurrying on eBay to track down an artillery M901 Hammerhead. But I'll leave that content for another video of another day. Like I showcased before, the turret itself can rotate or be positioned in any of the 360 degrees that we have here. The piece can also elevate and depress, and along with the top portion, the bottom base can do so as well. To do so, however, on the model here, there's a molded in umbilical cord that we have in the section. Although molded is actually a poor choice of words because the piece is separate and is telescoping. I could move it in and out, and why this is important is because if I want to position the unit at a certain angle or height, this can be achieved by simply moving this section up or down. If I want to display it in the transport mode, this can be done. However, the little tube has to be pushed in further, and then once completed, the unit can lock into its storage mode that we see right here. It is an interesting feature to have somewhat of a functional capability to this. However, this is kind of outside of the kit confines. The way the kit's designed is that you're actually supposed to glue everything in place at the appropriate height that you wish to have it at. By not gluing the parts on, you achieve the quasi-functional state that I have here. Although I will say that it's best to just prop it to a height that you deem fit and leave it at that. After prolonged use, the umbilical cord here will start scratching, and it's something that could eventually hurt the look of the build. Moving down from the optic housing mount takes us to the arms themselves. Like I showcased earlier, I went ahead and made a mistake during the rebuild process where I deformed some of the detailing found on this section. But, like I stated earlier, the detailing was replaced and fully repaired. So much so that this here is the kit original, and if I turn the turntable over, this is the side that was repaired. Honestly, if I didn't mention it, I doubt anyone would have ever noticed. From the housing mount takes us down to the vehicle's defensive armament, but in this case it's the only armament that this vehicle has, and for this model here I equipped it with an FN Mag 7.62mm machine gun. This weapon, of course, was adopted by the US military and is designated as the M240. The kit originally did not supply you with this pattern of weaponry. Instead, it came with an M60D machine gun. I looked through my stash to see if I could track down the original parts, but sadly, I was unable to do so. So I went ahead and had this unit on hand, which was spare from another model, which I'm going to be doing a model showcase video on, which should be posted in the near future after this video drops. The model itself is a spare piece from Trumpeter, and the Trumpeter component is extremely nicely detailed and was a nice addition to add to this build. In order to secure it in place, the unit has a peg that's of course entirely molded into the bottom of the pintle mount. In order to secure it to the kit's machine gun mount, all I had to do was slightly widen the bottom portion here of the mount with a pin vise. Once this was done, the Trumpeter component is dropped directly into the location you see it here, and it completes the look of the build. Moving to the paint and the markings, obviously this vehicle here has a 3-tone NATO camouflage pattern, which we all saw me apply earlier on in the video. The model, however, since those scenes, has been fully weathered to the condition that you see it here. For the weathering, I utilized the typical techniques that I've showcased and mentioned on other past videos, which include both airbrushing as well as dry brushing. For markings, well, this vehicle has none. As we saw, the markings that were originally supplied with the model were destroyed during the paint stripping process, plus they didn't really hold up all that well at the start of the build anyway. Sadly, I didn't have any appropriate markings in my spare decal bin, which would have been suitable for this build here, so for the time being anyhow, this one's going to remain markingless. However, this is not necessarily a ding on the model's accuracy. I have seen several military vehicles in real life that were still being used that didn't really have any markings on them. So having a vehicle in this condition is not necessarily inaccurate. However, if I do end up with a set of decals as time goes on that would be suitable for this build, I might possibly go ahead and add them at that point. But for now, it's going to roll markingless. Even though markings are not found on this model, the model is still fully coated with a coat of VMS varnish. The varnish really does a nice job with sealing everything in, as well as giving the model a unique look to it, which is one of those things that you really appreciate, specifically if you see it in person, as well as also giving a little bit more protection against things like dust or even just, fingerprints from handling. Well, in the end, I could not be any happier on how this Cinderella story turned out. As we saw in the beginning, this was probably one of the worst builds that I had in my collection, and dusting it off and bringing it up to the condition that we see here, it is definitely a sight for sore eyes. Not to mention, it's long since been overdue. And well, if you've gotten to this point in the video, I want to say thank you as well as congratulations. Apparently I can keep your attention long enough to get to this point. And with any luck, maybe you walked away from this video learning a few new techniques in order for you to incorporate either into your new builds, or possibly if you have an older cruddy build on the shelf, something that can go into your arsenal in order to restore it back to its former glory. More robust than a lot of people tend to give them credit for. If you have a model that's fallen into a state of disrepair, or possibly buy one for cheap at a flea market or a swap meet or something, they are far from being junk, and without a whole lot of elbow grease can possibly be polished into something that can be a nice highlight in your collection. But no need to continue loitering on this topic. This model here, of course, is going to be boxed and put in a prominent location in the collection, to which then I'll be able to start filming my next OTR project. And with that, that wraps up this episode of Old Tank Repair. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being small scale rebuild and model showcase videos like this one over here, to the other larger scale project update videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been showcased on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again, and I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Take care.